You're listening to Let's Talk Creation with Todd Wood and Paul Garner, the creation show where we learn, grow, and worship.
Well, welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Paul Garner and Todd Wood. I'm Paul Garner.
And I'm Todd Wood.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast. If you are, make sure that you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss all the great stuff we've got coming up. We have got some really exciting things coming up on the show. Also, why not leave us a positive review or comment? We love to hear from all of our listeners. That's great. And share the podcast with your friends. Of course, tell your friends about us. All of that good stuff. Todd, in today's episode, we are marking a very significant anniversary. It's 45 years this year since the famous eruption of Mt St Helens out there in Washington state on the 18th of May in 1980. So we thought it'd be great to dedicate an episode of the podcast to that anniversary. Todd, do you remember the eruption? What can you remember of it?
Not much. I was very young.
Yeah.
Oh goodness. I was just trying to think, was I in second grade or third grade? It would have been the end of the school year. I remember hearing about it. I remember seeing the news reports. I remember hearing about it, afterwards, as there were all these aftershocks and so forth. But no, I think I really actually learned about it in the 90s when I began learning about it from the likes of Steve Austin, who we've had on the show before. And I started to learn this sort of significance of what happened there, which was kind of amazing. And so, yeah, that sort of transformed my memory of it. But yeah, I definitely remember it happening. I remember it being on the news. But I was very young. Do you remember? Yeah. I mean, it wasn't your country that blew up, but do you remember anything about it?
Well, I do. I mean, like you, I was very young. I think I was about 11 years old at the time. So my memories are a bit hazy. But my strongest memory actually is of a photograph of the ash cloud from Mt St Helens, which was on the cover of one of our TV guides, the Radio Times, which was the BBC TV guide.
Wow. And
there was this sort of dramatic picture of the ash cloud. So that was probably my sort of first sort of encounter with Mt St Helens. I think it was advertising some kind of science documentary that was on at the time. And then, like you, I obviously learnt a lot about Mt St Helens and the eruption from the work that creationists were doing in the aftermath of the eruption. So that was how I got sort of introduced to it. But it did, of course, make news headlines around the world. I mean, people all over the world did hear about the eruption, and as we know, it led to some really fascinating new insights into the kinds of geological processes that perhaps were associated with the global flood in the days of Noah. So we thought it would be great to sort of mark this 45th anniversary with a special episode, and to help us sort of talk through all of this, we've got a special guest. Bill Hoesch, who is a geologist. So, Bill, welcome to the program. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be here. Hello, Todd.
Hello.
It's great to see you, Bill. Before we kind of get into Mt St Helens, perhaps you could just sort of introduce yourself to our listeners, tell them a bit about yourself, how you got interested in Mt St Helens, and also what you're doing now, because obviously you are at the Mt St Helens Creation Center out there in Washington State. So tell our listeners all about that.
Yes, we are located in the western coast of North America, here in Castle Rock, Washington. The Mt St Helens Creation Center is really functions like a visitor center, and we have some of the best information of any of the public visitor centers on the eruption, and especially the lessons learned from the eruption. And the lessons are profound to anybody thinking about Earth history. And that means anybody. And we're talking about, how do you interpret, prehistoric ages of dinosaurs? Kids need to hear that. And so we have we connect on a lot of different fronts on the whole creation issue. But my first experience with Mt St Helens was I had volcanic dust resting on my pickup truck in western Wyoming. I was a mud logger on a well site in western Wyoming, and the volcano blew and had a little nuisance of dust on my pickup truck, and had some beautiful red sunsets, and that's about all I remember.
Wow.
And I heard something on the news about a volcano erupting on the West Coast, but I said, let's get back to work, boys. We've got stuff to do. And so that was it. And then little did I know that 4 years later, I would be visiting the mountain on a field trip with Steve Austin. As a newborn Christian, I was not a believer when I was in Wyoming. And over that period of time, I came to faith. And so I had a whole new outlook on Earth history. And so it was a very exciting time for me to be there, especially with Steve. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. America's a big place. We over here we kind of forget that. So what if you're in Wyoming, news of what's going on in Washington State, it's a world away, I suppose. But talking about the ash that you had on your vehicle there, a friend at church actually gave me this. I've never been to Mt St Helens, but she had been, and she'd collected some volcanic ash from Mt St Helens, and I've actually got it here in this pot, which she kindly gave to me. So that's my little memento of the eruption that I have here.
So you've got a piece of North America with you there.
Piece of North America, yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. So as we kind of think about the eruption of Mt St Helens, perhaps we should begin right at the beginning and sort of set the scene for our listeners by talking about the volcano before the eruption. What was Mt St Helens like? What was the landscape like? And did geologists at the time have any awareness that an imminent eruption was about to happen?
Yes, many people regarded that whole scene of Mt St Helens and Spirit Lake, a large lake nestled to the north side of the volcano, as the most scenic place in North America. Many people said that. And it was that dramatic because the mountain towered over the lake, and it was only a distance of about 5 miles away from the summit of the mountain, and it stood 6,500 feet above the lake level, which is a greater relief than when you're standing on the rim of Grand Canyon looking down. It's a tremendous relief, and it's a very dramatic picture. And it was the lake was surrounded with virgin forest, Douglas fir, and different species of conifer, including logs that were, a 6, 8, 10-foot diameter and greater. So those are big trees. Trees grow in the Northwest like nowhere else on Earth, and so the timber industry played a big role in the eruption and the aftermath and so on.
Were there many people living there at the time? And was it a place that people went on holiday and a vacation and visited?
Yeah, so Spirit Lake was a destination for people, especially in the springtime. It was in May 18th, and so people were wanting to get out to their summer homes or seasonal cottages and so on around the lake. And only a few people were permanent residents, like Harry Truman. But people were coming and going, and there was active logging in the area. Within the area that became the blast zone, there was active logging, and every logger around this area, thanks God it happened on a Sunday and not on a Monday, because it would have been hundreds dead instead of 57.
Right. Wow.
So it's a dramatic landscape around here. Even today, looking at the remains of a mountain that blew its top off is tremendous teaching lessons that are fun to think about, to kind of review the moving parts of the eruption and to get your brain around the scale of things that are so beyond normal human experience that it can be a challenge. Sure.
So did the eruption come out of the blue, or were there signs that something was happening there before the eruption actually happened?
Yeah, for about 6 or 7 weeks before the big eruption, there were several precursor eruptions that at the time seemed pretty dramatic, but looking back, they were quite small. And people sort of got conditioned into thinking the volcano is this is what it does when it erupts. And it became almost like a party atmosphere. People began bottling volcanic ash on the roadside and selling it to tourists and so on. And people thought, oh, this is fun. The volcano's erupting. And nobody knew that the big one was coming, right?
Yeah.
There were the geologists, tragically, David Johnson, who's got a ridge named after him today. He was the geologist that was stationed on that ridge called Coldwater 2. And of course, he was monitoring the bulge on the north slope. The mountain had been swelling at a rate of about 5 feet per day. The mountain was growing. On the morning of May 18th, it was 450 feet out of its normal profile. It was, I'm told it was imminent, or it looked ominous, I should say. That's what David Johnson said. And he was warning others to get out of the area, and he was the one who was there. Of course, when the eruption came, he was right in the path of the debris avalanche that came off the north slope, and he was overtaken by the blast that outraced the debris avalanche. And so they never found his remains. So geologists had a good sense of the potential of a lateral blast, not a vertical blast, but a lateral one. And that's exactly what happened.
So that bulge on the slope of the volcano, I mean, what causes that? Is that magma building up sort of within the volcano, or what's steam? What's causing it?
Yeah, magma and volatiles were pushing on the flank of the mountain, causing the bulge. And I'm told it was cracking and it looked ominous. And why anybody was anywhere near the area, I'll never know, because it must have looked, I've seen pictures of it, and it just looked spooky to see that bulge. Especially people who knew the mountain profile before the eruption.
Yeah. So the eruption, the big eruption, took place on the 18th of May, 1980,
Right.
And it was in the morning. Talk us through the events of that day.
Sure.
What actually happened?
Yeah, so 8:32 in the morning, a 5.1 earthquake rattled the summit. There happened to be two geologists flying overhead in a small Cessna aircraft at the time. They were right over the summit, and they got some of the world-famous pictures that we have today. And they had to put the airplane into evasive maneuvers when it blew. It was that serious. They thought they were dead. They really thought they were it was over.
Yeah.
I think they were saying their prayers. But what they witnessed was at first rocks tumbling into the crater on the summit, and they thought, oh, that's fun. We're seeing some geologic activity. What they didn't know was that a 5.1 earthquake just rattled the summit. And what they saw next really made their hair stand on end, because that entire north slope of the mountain began moving. This is the largest landslide in recorded history. No one has witnessed a bigger landslide than this one and lived to talk about it. So this was about half a cubic mile of material that slid northward and quickly transitioned into a debris avalanche. And then it transitioned from there with time into a mud flow down that valley, North Fork of the Toutle Valley. But the landslide slid into Spirit Lake. Part of it slammed into Spirit Lake directly to the north of the volcano. And that generated a tsunami, of course. When you give water a good shove, it's incompressible fluid, right? And so it produced a wave. I like to ask people, how big do you think the water wave was on the far end of the lake that sloshed up the side of the mountain? It was 860 feet. And we take groups and we look at the scour marks on the side of that mountain. That's one of the things we do here. We lead field adventures out to the mountain in the summer months. We're getting ready for a busy field season coming up. So the water wave sloshed up the side of the mountain and took logs that were blown down by the lateral blast only moments before and swept them into the lake. The lake was 3/4 covered with logs. It was a big lake and about 1 million logs, gigantic logs floating in the lake. And the geologists afterwards, later on that day, they reported back, or maybe the next day, they said the lake is gone. The lake is gone, because you couldn't see any water on the lake. The ash and the logs and everything covered it up. And so that water wave was one big part of the eruption. Of course, the major segment of the landslide crashed down the North Fork of the Toutle Valley, and it moved about 15 miles down that valley as it crashed like a locomotive train, like a runaway train down that valley fast. and it just smashed and landed in the valley, leaving a 200-foot deposit about 15 miles long and 1 or 2 miles wide. So it's Earth's newest landscape out there, and remarkable to look at that deposit.
Mm.
We lead groups in there as well in the summer months. So the landslide was the big part of that, kind of uncorked the eruption, you see. And the landslide, this is not the largest volcano by any means in recorded history, but it was the largest landslide. So that's worth talking about. And then when the pressure was released on the magma chamber at depth, the volatiles, especially the water vapor or water, flashed to steam or flashed to vapor phase. And that volume expansion, it was phase change that caused the lateral blast. It expanded rapidly, and the blast cloud took down, it traveled outward at speeds of upwards of 650 miles an hour, which is jetliner speed. And that's what blew down the trees, just lifted trees off their, just sheared them at soil level and sent them flying like arrows. In the interior part of the blast zone, the exterior part, they were just knocked down. They left the trees on the hills, the hill slopes were left on the trees, scattered about like little vectors pointing to the current flow of that lateral blast. So you could call it a dilute pyroclastic flow, but it was other people described it as a rock storm, rock and ash and steam and just vaporizing everything in its path. It's super hot, 1,000 degrees centigrade or something like that. And so it was that was the big hazard. That's what killed 57 people.
Yeah. You don't want to be in the path of one of those things. There was I read about a geologist who was at a place called Bare Meadows, I think, who took some famous photos of the blast cloud. Do you want to just tell us something about his story?
Right. So 11 miles away was a location called Bare Meadow, and not geologist, but an amateur photographer, Gary Rosen. He actually had his camera set up on a tripod, and they thought maybe they'd see something nice that day. They might see a little explosion, And so he had his camera trained on the volcano, and I'm told they were enjoying a very pleasant evening and a nice morning. That I can picture those two guys having a cup of coffee in the morning, and then one of them looked up at the mountain. Well, first of all, they felt the earthquake. I'm sure they must have felt that 5.1 earthquake. One of them looked up at the mountain and said, "There goes the whole mountain." And they started snapping pictures, right? And their pictures are now world famous, of course. And we've got some of them here. But and so they started, and they barely made it out with their lives because that blast cloud, they captured photographs of it traveling like a cloud, a ground-hugging slurry of hot ash, steam, and rock just plowing across the forest and the landscape, approaching their position at speeds of hundreds of miles per hour. And they got out just barely with their lives.
Wow.
They hit the gas pedal on that late model Pontiac and took off down that logging road. How they got out of there, I'll never know. But because it was pitch black for them, their car was pelted with golf ball size pieces of ash. It just so happened the ridge in front of them was just sufficient to direct the waning energy of that blast cloud up over their heads, and they escaped underneath a cloud of darkness, you see.
That's just extraordinary. And I guess because the speed of sound is less than the speed of light, I mean, would you actually begin to see the blast before you hear the blast?
Yeah, what was really peculiar is people within a 40-mile radius, most people reported hearing nothing.
Yeah.
Because the sound waves were pushed up into the atmosphere.
Oh, right.
And reflection of those sound waves further north, there were hundreds of miles to the north. They heard a loud boom in Seattle. They heard it in British Columbia, and even in Saskatchewan, they heard a blast, right? But people within a 40-mile radius heard, most of them heard nothing. And it was almost unreal to see, to watch the blast happening and not hearing much of anything.
It's just extraordinary.
It
Todd,
is.
You
So beyond human experience, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's horrifying, really. I mean, if you think about it, because 57 people died, and I was reading up a little bit on these things, getting ready for this episode, and I read about Harry Truman, not the president, but the resident
Right.
of Spirit Lake
Right.
there, and he just scoffed at all the warnings and said, no,
Yeah.
that mountain's not going to blow. And he became kind of a folk hero. People were
Yes.
excited and cheering him on. And then he
Yeah.
get buried. He get totally buried. Just
Sure.
unnecessary
tragic-
death.
Very tragic figure.
Yeah.
Turns out he lost his life. His wife lost her life a few years before, and the poor fellow, he turned to the bottle. He was mostly an alcoholic, so he was hardly coherent most of the time.
Mm.
But and the media made him into a folk hero, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's
And he got
crazy.
invited. What was tragic? We got invited to speak at elementary school kids, and spoke to kids, and he told them about, I'm a part of the mountain's a part of me, and I'm never leaving, and I'm proud to be here, and nothing's going to happen to me. All that kind of proud talk. And the kids just loved Harry, and they sent him card afterwards. This is a week before the eruption. He received cards in the mail from these delightful little children saying, Harry, we're so proud of you. We love you. And it was some of the rescue people, or the public servants, the police and so on, they were almost on the verge of persuading Harry to leave. And then he got that card from the school, and they said that was it. He hardened. And so he went down with the ship, so to speak.
Yeah.
Mm.
Oh, good grief.
That's very sobering, and there's a spiritual lesson there, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we should heed warnings. Yeah, serious warnings.
Yeah, so all 57 people who died, including Harry, they all got up and ate their breakfast that morning. They all put on their pants one leg at a time. Not one was planning to die, but they did. They thought tomorrow will be just like today, only better. And that's the way most of us live, right?
Yeah.
We don't think
Yeah.
of imminent,
Imminent doom.
life is precarious,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So 57 people lost their lives. A lot of damage was done as well, I understand. So
Yeah.
can you tell us about some of that? I mean, I think I read about, whole logging operations being swept away and
Oh,
bridges
yeah.
being swept away.
Yeah, so if we're restricting ourselves to the North Fork of the Toutle, which was really the powerful side of the volcano, that debris avalanche that landed in the North Fork of the Toutle, it had chunks of glacier ice in it, as well as snow, mixed with hot volcanic ash. Of course, that produces a mixture. That's that three-letter word called mud. And the mud flowed from there. It eventually bubbled out of that debris avalanche deposit and flowed like fresh mortar, like wet concrete. It flowed down that valley a width of a mile or more in width in places, tens of feet deep probably. And it flowed down the valley such that the center of the flow was higher than the edges of the flow. In other words, it was truly a cement-like slurry. And it was carrying logs and houses and cars and boulders, and it sweeping it free everything in its path, including a very large warehouse, or one of the logging camps that was situated there, very large one with lots of equipment. So you can picture, if you can, further downstream, there were just houses and cars and logging trucks and bridge trusses, and all this was just bobbing in the mud as it crashed down that valley. It wasn't going super fast. It was probably, you would run if you saw it. You wouldn't walk away from it. You'd run probably 10 miles an hour or something like that. That was the one that took out 25 bridges, 250 homes. That's the sum total of all the mud flows around the volcano. Incredible damage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The greatest financial loss came from the mud flows, or I'm using the word mud flow. The proper word is lahar. Of course, that's the Indonesian term, but mud serves my purposes.
That's great. Yeah. So the immediate eruption happens. That's on May the 18th, but there are after effects. So tell us. I mean, what was this landscape like when people first went back in? I mean, I guess there was some kind of rescue operation, presumably, to go in
Yeah.
afterwards.
Yeah.
And give us some insight into what they found.
Yeah, well, there were hundreds of people. They estimate 200 people were airlifted out by helicopter in the days following. And it turns out that in terms of the emergency operators, it was a big disaster on many levels. You had the mud crashing down the valley, you had the volcano still erupting, you had darkness over the mountain, and you had people to be rescued. It turns out that the Weyerhaeuser people, the logging operators, they were the ones most familiar with the roads and most familiar with getting around and navigating in that difficult terrain where the terrain was completely changed by the eruption. And they became some of the heroes of the disaster. Public officials like geologists, they were almost, they did, the news media would stick a microphone in their face. They didn't know what to say. And they didn't help too much.
Yeah.
What's coming next, geologists? Please tell us, right? And they didn't have much to say. But eventually people got a hold of it and began to realize the scale of the disaster. And 57 died, and countless animals and vegetation. The place looked like the surface of the moon. Those are the words of President Jimmy Carter. And when he flew over the area, it was unreal to see that, especially, when I came out here in 1985, I think it was, when I was on that field trip. I remember driving my pickup truck over this ridge, and you're driving in the Pacific Northwest, and everything is green. Everything is deep forest. Everything is shade. It's, there are big trees out here that grow. I remember driving over this ridge, and then as far as the eye could see, everything was gray, like the surface of the moon. It was just, and there were some plants, this is 5 years later, some plants were growing by then, of course, but it wasn't, small weeds were growing. That's all there was. It took your breath away. It was that large, and that was just my experience. I was not here when the eruption happened.
So that kind of gives some sense, I think, of how catastrophic this event was. But put it in some kind of geological context for us, would you, Bill? Because Mt St Helens is actually not a very big volcano, and this was not a big eruption by geological standards. So give us some sense of how small this volcano really is.
So to give you some idea, this one was, it just so happens Mt St Helens is the most studied volcano in history. Others, of course, were much larger. Even 10 years later, Mount Pinatubo in Philippines was 10 times larger. Wow. But it didn't get the news headlines, and it didn't get the scientific study this one got. There's been volcanoes, I think it was Nova Erupta in Alaska that was 25 times larger than this one. Individual eruptions were that much larger. And so it is a small volcano. And it reminds me that we live in a time of grace today. I don't think we live in a time when there are huge volcanoes going off. I think that, and as you work your way further back in history, to the period of the Ice Age, you've got volcanoes that were 2,000 times bigger than Mt St Helens. So if you're anywhere in North America when Yellowstone was lifting its lid, it would have ruined your whole day. Yeah. Right? Because it was, it's unspeakable to think about the scale of that kind of a volcano. Individual eruptions, 2,000 times bigger than Mt St Helens, that would have impact on global atmosphere, everything during the Ice Age. And so it's all you have to do is review the history of the scale of volcanoes down through history, and you can thank God that we live in a time of grace where we don't have those kind of volcanoes happening today. We don't have those kind of earthquakes or tsunamis and so on.
It's just staggering. I mean, you can't imagine an eruption that is, thousands of times bigger than Mt St Helens. But we know from the geological record there have been eruptions like that.
Absolutely.
In history.
Yeah.
So,
you can see the eruptive products from Yellowstone, Huckleberry Ridge Tuff, and so on, and you can see that was an individual eruption that was on a magnitude that it's hard to wrap your brain around. It's just hard to understand.
Yeah, that's just astonishing. So let's think then at this point about some of the geological lessons that we can learn from Mt St Helens. I've heard Steve Austin and others sort of talk about Mt St Helens as a sort of miniature laboratory that gives us some insights into processes that may have happened during the flood. Just talk us through some of the things we can learn at Mt St Helens about the way the Earth works and what these kinds of processes can accomplish.
Yeah, it ought to humble the geologist to think about that you can form canyons 140 feet deep in one day. It doesn't take long ages. You get water and sediment in the water moving at high speed, and you can cut rock like soft butter. It's not a problem to carve rock. You don't need time to do it. You need energy, right? And if you have energetic processes, it's no problem. And so canyon's 140 feet deep. It's so cool to look at the canyon out there, and you can hike into it. And if you took a geologist and blindfolded him, brought him in there and said, how old do you think this canyon is? What would he do? He would say, I see a small stream running through the middle of it. And it's 140 feet deep. It must have taken that stream a long time to carve that canyon. Why? Why does he do that? Because he's convinced that the present is the key to the past and all that kind of rubbish that is very misleading. It turns out that little stream had nothing to do with the origin of that canyon. It was a mud flow that carved that canyon in one day. A raging mud flow came down in 1982 and downcut a network of canyons, in fact, and that was just one of them. So it's fun to think about that and think about Earth history as sudden spasmodic things in Earth history can do enormous change, and we shouldn't minimize that when we investigate Earth history.
And that canyon that you're talking about there was carved through the deposits that had been formed on the 18th of May, I think.
Right.
You can sort of see them in the walls of the canyon. So tell us about some of the rock layers that were formed as a result of the eruption and the aftermath.
Yeah, so when that mud flow carved the canyon, it gave a nice profile of the deposits, and you can look at the layers in the wall of the canyon, and each layer has a date. You know what happened at this point and at this point and here and there, and you can identify a 25-foot thick section of stratified rock that was the product of a pyroclastic flow. Now, a dense pyroclastic flow that was super hot and fast, and that deposit, it just laid down strata, probably in a matter of minutes. But it was less than one day that you had a 25-foot thick strata section. And I always thought that stratified rock took long ages to form. How do you get strata forming in a pyroclastic flow? What's going on inside that flow? Is there pulsating kind of currents? Nobody knows these things. This is the cutting edge of geology today, is fluid dynamics, right? What's going on inside a turbulent kind of a thing like that? And this is it's really fun to think about.
Yeah.
But we can see the after effect. It left a layered deposit that looks just like rock that if I would have looked at years ago when I was a youngster, I would have said, well, obviously that took long ages to form, and I'd be wrong.
Yeah. It's astonishing to me that something as fast-moving, catastrophic as a pyroclastic flow can produce very fine laminae, kind of millimeter scale laminae.
Exactly.
And cross-bedding and graded bedding and all of these things that you see in sediments, deposited by water, and yet it was produced very rapidly. It's mind-boggling to me.
It's counterintuitive, isn't it, to think that a catastrophic thing can produce layering. But we know on the seafloor today, the most catastrophic deposits we know on the seafloor, these submarine so-called turbidity currents that are utterly catastrophic, and they produce the most neatly layered deposits we know of. And so it's almost counterintuitive that catastrophes produce layered material. That's kind of basic law.
So we learn about rock laminae, rock layering. We learn about canyon formation. Tell us about the trees in Spirit Lake, because there's another interesting story there, right?
Oh yeah, two different things to talk about regarding the trees. First of all, you had about 1 million logs with multiple species All right, mostly Douglas fir, but you had noble fir, you had varieties of cedar, you had varieties of spruce, and so on. And the peculiar thing was they were tracked over the years following the eruption. And of course, logs, when they're floating in water, they eventually they become heavy with water, they settle to the bottom, and they sink, right? But how do they sink? That's what's funny. Many of them would float in a vertical position because the root ball tends to be heavier. And if the water's deep enough, they'll float vertically, lots of them. And when they get totally saturated, they settle to the bottom in a vertical position. And if you were to drain Spirit Lake today, it would look like about 20,000 trees standing vertically on the bottom of that lake. You would call it a petrified forest or something of that sort, right? And because of what was learned at Mt St Helens, they've restudied other so-called petrified forests, and they discovered, oh my goodness, like at Yellowstone, they discovered, well, these petrified logs at Yellowstone, they look a lot like the logs on the bottom of Spirit Lake. The roots terminate very abruptly. Isn't that strange? So we don't see any real soil zone here either. And we don't really see this and that and the other thing. And many people have reinterpreted so much of other places in the world because of what we see at Mt St Helens. And the logs did settle in species order as well. I didn't mention that.
Wow.
And so after the first year, all the noble fir settled out. And then a year later, the next species, the cedars fell out the next week. And they settled in species specific fashion. In other words, some species had more resin in their materials than others. And so if you had sedimentation going on at the same time, what would it look like? It would look like an evolutionary succession of one species giving rise to another, giving rise to the next. But that's not what it is at all. That just gives me an open mind to think about how do we interpret stratified sequences. And then the second lesson from the floating logs was of course, within a year or 2 years, most of the bark rubbed off those logs because the wind would blow those logs around as a mat, and the tree bark would settle to the bottom. And it was several years later when Steve Austin went diving underneath there to document that you have a 3-foot thick layer of tree bark rich peat lining large parts of the lake bottom. And so if you had subsequent eruption following, and you had subsequent burial, it'd be the perfect scenario for the origin of coal. And of course, Steve was a former student at Penn State University, a young buck in 1979 defending his PhD dissertation. This is one of the greatest things I get to brag about for Steve. There he was at Penn State with an outrageous theory for the origin of coal. But he had enough backbone to go through it all. He said, I think there was a big flood that covered North America, and you've got it wrong when you talk about an ancient swamp. And they said, Steve, we got to give it to you. It's an outrageous hypothesis, but here's your PhD. Please be on your way. And the year was 1979. Less than a year later, Mt St Helens erupted. And I sometimes wonder if God didn't erupt the volcano just to vindicate Steve, because suddenly Steve is like this. Steve is like, what? He says, I've got a real model of something I proposed as an abstract theory only months ago. And so he was blown away by that. And I use that to encourage young people. If God's given you the conviction that the Bible is true in any discipline, you ought to stick to that conviction, because I think God's going to vindicate you. I think that's what he did with Steve.
And I should mention here, if I may, I haven't checked this recently, but if you go onto Google Maps or Google Earth and you zoom in on Spirit Lake today, you should be able to see those logs still floating there. There are logs still floating there, and if you zoom in close enough, you will be able to see them. And it's pretty amazing.
They're big logs. We go down and hike to them every summer, but they're 100% Douglas fir. You don't see any other species today. So the Douglas fir have the highest resin content, I suspect.
That's interesting. Todd, you've been to Yellowstone as well. I think didn't you go to Specimen Ridge? Have you been there?
Did. I went to Specimen Ridge, yeah. Very nearly killed me, but I got there.
Because Bill, when you were talking there about those fossil forests at Yellowstone, I mean, place like Specimen Ridge, there are multiple levels where you've got sort of volcanic sediments, and interspersed with those volcanic sediments, you've got those trees buried, those fossilized trees, many of them in upright positions.
Yep.
Mhm.
And as you say, I mean, one of the amazing things about that is that they're lacking roots. They appear not to be in the place where they grew. They've been
Right.
transported in, right? So
Right.
yeah,
Yes.
And it is
So you
weird.
have to,
Having been there, it is pretty obviously some kind of catastrophic debris flow. I mean, the stuff that it's in is just full of junk. It looks like there was some sort of catastrophic flow that happened there that put those trees there. And yeah, there are these weird upright logs, and you look at the bottom of them and there's nothing. It's just been sheared off there at Specimen Ridge. So yeah, it's a pretty impressive thing. If you ever get a chance to go, Paul, maybe we should schedule a trip or something.
well, it's a very beautiful hike to go up there.
It is,
Very
yeah.
impressive. Look at those
Yeah.
trees made of glass, you know.
Yeah,
yeah.
it's wild stuff.
We should definitely do that, Todd. That's definitely a trip for us to plan. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, so these amazing lessons from Mount St Helens, these geological lessons. How does this relate to the flood? I mean, can we sort of use Mount St Helens as a kind of small scale modern analog of, you know, we've talked about the trees. Yeah, and how can other events, other similar catastrophic events, sort of help to give us some insights into the flood and maybe solve some puzzles?
Yeah, when we think that, you know, stratified rock, upright buried trees that appear to be like forests, origin of coal, these kind of, and even isotopes that have lots of daughter product in them, that also was discovered here. And you say to yourself, what, you know, if these things can happen quickly and it doesn't require millions of years, well then, what is the nature of the commitment we have to this time scale of millions of years? If isotopes don't prove it, if layered rock doesn't prove it, if origin of, you know, large canyons and coal and all that kind of thing, what is the commit? Is there something else at work here? That's the question we ought to be thinking. And my mind is drawn to the passage in 2 Peter 3 that where the apostle is warning the church that in the last days scoffers are going to come, and they're going to say, "Where's the promise of your Jesus' second coming?" Because obviously all things continue as they were from the beginning, don't they? You say, and the answer is we know that the present is not the key to the past, and all you have to do is go to Mt St Helens and demonstrate that. You can project present rates backward in time and construct a history of the earth if you want to, presuming that things occur at a slow and steady rate. And you can talk big about your millions of years, but there's other modeling to be done to demonstrate things much more catastrophic in the rock record. And that's what makes it really fun to be a creationist geologist, is there's tons of things to be discovered out there. And young people are given the impression that the scientific community has pretty much figured things out. And if you like to study geology, that's kind of cool, but we've really got the big questions already mastered, you see. And kids are beaten down with that. It's tragic.
Yeah.
It's just the opposite. There's so much mystery out there.
Yeah, and an event like Mount St Helens, unexpected, can just open your eyes to a whole new vista of discovery.
Yeah.
So yeah, and this sort of happens all the time. Now,
On several different levels, that's true, Paul, because you look at the beauty that followed the destruction, and you can see the regrowth of plants and animals coming back. And that's another lesson is, nature has a way of covering itself up. And so many of the most beautiful and tranquil and peaceful places on earth were the most violent in the past. And so that ought to be a lesson for people who believe that there was a global flood in Earth history, because the Earth tends to cover itself up, and it tends, here at Mount St. Helens, as the years go by, it gets more and more difficult to explain to young people the scale of this eruption. It's healing itself, you see. And when we think about Earth history, we ought to remember that.
Yeah. That's very interesting. It reminds me actually of standing in the English Lake District by a lovely, beautiful, placid lake looking at the rocks on the shore of the lake. And what were they? They were volcanic mud flows. They were lahar deposits there on the shore of the lake. You can't imagine, that was what was going on at that spot at one time. It's just incredible. And that kind of brings us on then to what I wanted to kind of talk about here as we sort of begin to wind up this episode, which is the recovery. Because we're now 45 years on from the eruption in 1980. And one of the lessons that we've also learned at the volcano is how animals and plants and other organisms have recovered in the aftermath of the volcano. So give us some insights into some of the things that we've learned there.
Studying the mountain has been a fascinating thing for the biologists as much as the geologists, because they can see that when you take a biological system that's in equilibrium and you shift it out of that equilibrium, how it responds again is a totally different research question than studying nature under static conditions. And so, for example, the deer and the elk had record numbers following the eruption, the record numbers of twins and triplets. And what was going on there? Did the catastrophe trip the hormone system of these creatures? Those kind of questions are, I'm not sure anybody knows, right? You had this one humble creature living in the woods before the eruption called the pocket gopher, right? They're the ones that destroy lawns, right? But they lived in the woods, and in other words, everybody loves to hate the things, but they lived in the woods before the eruption. No doubt they saw the blast cloud coming. They knew they weren't going to outrun that thing. They went down into their holes, right? At least the ones in the exterior portion of the blast zone. They went into their holes and they survived the blasts, and they eventually stirred the blanket of volcanic ash above them, mixing it with the soil, and the seeds were in the old soil underneath. And they were very effective farmers that reseeded tremendous amounts of real estate in that blast zone afterwards. And who could have foreseen that, you see? And there were almost no predators around, so the things multiplied like fleas. They're everywhere, mixing and churning that soil. And they really did have a profound impact on the rate of recovery. And so then there's other studies that have been done as well of the certain organisms they suspect went through an epigenetic change, right? Or something tripped in their genome, where they went from plan A to plan B, something like that. And for example, the salamander, they underwent what's called neoteny, which is a change in their life cycle, where they transition, so to speak, into an entirely aquatic animal, where they don't come up on land at all.
Wow.
And so that's fun to think about. And so that gets into the question of, blind cave fish and so on. What's going on there? Those kind of questions are fun research things to explore. So there's just so much mystery to think about. So the animal recovery, the plant recovery, what were the first plants to come in? The prairie lupin just happens to be a nitrogen fixating plant that helps to fertilize the soil for the next plants to come in. And the whole succession is on its way back. And today you can see it in transition. You can go out and hike in the landslide debris zone, the debris avalanche zone, and a hummocky kind of landscape in there. And you can see these ponds and lakes and trees and forests coming back. Today it's mostly an alder forest, but it won't be long before the conifers come. And so things are regrowing, and so it's fun to think about. But the aftermath had other elements to it as well. The sediment was a big issue. Sediment coming down the North Fork of the Toutle was enormous. And it deposited sediment in the Cowlitz River, in the Columbia River. It closed shipping in the Columbia River for 2 weeks so they could get the thing dredged out. And to this day, it costs millions to keep that river dredged for international shipping and so on, as well as the Cowlitz, because you have to have a certain margin for spring flooding. And if you choke the channel with lots and lots of silt and mud, well, then there goes your safety margin. And so sediment is a big issue out here. It costs a lot of money to keep these rivers dredged, and they're always looking for solutions. The river continues to wear away at the landslide debris It continues to eat away at that, and the river continues to be choked with sediment. It still ranks among the most sediment-choked rivers in the Northwest, at North Fork of the Toutle. Small river, it's just depositing truckloads of sediment every minute almost.
It's
And so
amazing.
that's a big issue, is the sediment. And yeah,
How did the animals in the lake, in Spirit Lake, fare? You talked about that enormous water wave, sort of 860 feet high, and all those logs going into the lake. I mean, did anything in the lake survive?
no,
No.
I don't think anybody believes it. First of all, the whole lake was displaced. The surface of the lake was lifted 200 feet higher than the previous lake was. So it's truly a brand new lake. It was probably boiled, and it was just
Wow.
a seething pot of just death after the eruption. It just looked ominous, and it was fun because they were watching the zoology and the plants coming back into the lake itself, and they were having fun observing this. The biologists were, and then somebody discovered there's a rainbow trout in here. How'd that get in here? They think somebody planted it because they didn't. And so the things grew like crazy. It was just, they would feed on the microorganisms that were rich underneath that floating log mat, and they grew to be like 5.5 pounds in a period of 5 years or so. Gigantic fish that grew enormously, that completely beyond what they thought rainbow trout could do. Anyway, so that's a lot of fun things. Yeah.
Todd, have you got any last sort of questions or comments before we start to wind things up?
No, I just, you're talking about the scale of this. And I remember a number of years ago, I visited very briefly the Mt St Helens Center there, and we drove up. I'm thinking it was January or February. It was bitter cold. But I remember on the drive up there, there's a number of structures and I think vehicles still that people have left buried and sticking out of the ground. So if you're trying to think about what that scale is, that is one of those visual cues as you drive up towards the mountain overlook there. It's just astonishing. And you drive by and you think that is crazy, because it looks now, like you say, it's all recovered. So it looks like, it's this person's yard, but there's this, there's the cab of a truck sticking up, or there's the top of a roof sticking out of the ground. And it's just so weird. And yeah, it really gives you a sense of how big that is as you go up there. But so tell us a little bit about the Mt St Helens Center. How can we hook up with you? How can we find out about tours and schedule stuff? Tell us all about that stuff as we close this out here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is a happening place. This is a really cool place to visit. We've got creation museums around the North America, the big one in Kentucky, and here and there. But we've got one in the Northwest. It's a humble little watering hole, but this is a really happening place. We do, our main activity here is field adventures. We're out 2 to 3 times a week, going out to the mountain, leading groups of 40, 50, 60 people. We offer inexpensive tours to the mountain, it's an educational trip. We do like a car caravan. We'll leave with 10 or 15 different vehicles, something like that. And we motor out and we teach. We do a field trip. And that's our main activity in the summertime. We have a lot of fun. You get 40 or 50 kids hopping and skipping on the trail in the woods. And they are just having fun, right? And you get to teach them something along the way, and that's what's really good. And so then the winter months we do our creation worldview class. That's what we get a couple dozen kids in here every winter, and we go for 20 weeks right through the winter months, and we teach them the origin of man, the origin of species, the origin of the universe, the fossil record, dinosaurs. We go through these things and we explore them using science and scripture, and it's become a really we're kind of settled here as a place where it's a center of information like that. And we get visitors here, skeptics, we get PhDs, we get people wandering in, we get mostly convinced Christians traveling from around the world. Missionaries come and visit here, and they hear about it and they want to come, and we take them to the mountain. We have a good time.
It's fantastic.
That sounds fantastic.
And we're supported entirely by donations. We don't have any big supporters. We have a little newsletter that goes out a couple times a year, and that's it. It's a small operation, but it's a happening thing.
And where can people find you online? And
we're
sign up for the newsletter?
Good. Mt St Helens Creation Center, and it's mshcreationcenter.org, and you can learn all about us on there and find out what we do and sign up for our newsletter, contact us, questions, that kind of thing. Happy to help.
That's great. We will put all of those details as well in the show notes, so you can find those. One last thing, I want to recommend this little book. If you haven't got a copy of this, viewers and listeners, Footprints in the Ash by John Morris and Stephen Austin, all about the eruption of Mt St Helens and many of the things we've been talking about in this episode. Do pick up a copy of that. It's really worth having on your bookshelf. Bill, that has been fantastic. I know our listeners are going to love this episode. It's been fascinating to talk to you about it. And I'm sure there are lots of other topics that we could talk about too. So maybe we'll be able to have you back on again in the future. That would be absolutely great. But thanks for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Well, I feel very much the same way, Paul. It's really good talking to you again. I don't get to see you enough, huh? And
it's been a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a while. Last time Bill and I were together was in England. Bill, you came over and we went out to look at some rocks, didn't we, on the East Coast, and ended up having fish and chips on the coast. So yeah, but we don't see one another often enough. So great to have you on today. Thank you again. Thanks to all of our viewers and listeners. Do make sure that you tune in 2 weeks' time to see what's coming up then. I'm sure it'll be fun, and we'll see you then. We'll see you in a fortnight.
See you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Talk Creation. For more information, visit us at letstalkcreation.org, where you'll find an archive of past episodes and all our show notes. If you'd like to leave a comment or make a suggestion, you can find us on all the major social media platforms. Let's Talk Creation is brought to you in the U.S. by Core Academy of Science and in the U.K. by Biblical Creation Trust. As a listener-supported ministry, we are grateful for all of your financial support. Find out how you can make a contribution at our website, letstalkcreation.org. Also remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. Thanks, and see you next time.